This week, the European Court of Justice ruled that a 2022 EU directive aimed at ensuring an adequate minimum wage in all 27 member states is valid. Denmark had tried to block it, arguing that the EU was overstepping its powers by legislating on pay. But the ruling now requires that countries with statutory minimum wages to ensure that they are fair and adequate, and has led to some speculation about whether the EU could one day impose a minimum wage across all member states. A controversial idea, not least because not all EU countries currently even have a statutory minimum wage. So in this video, we'll explore whether the EU could realistically introduce a mandatory minimum wage, and what it could mean for workers across the bloc. If you love staying informed and want some of the best reporting on YouTube, then subscribe and ring the bell for more. First, let's start with some context. Minimum wage rules aren't uniform across the EU because Article 153, Article 5 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union prevents the Commission from setting binding wage laws. As a result, not all countries have a statutory minimum wage, though most do, with 22 out of the 27 member states having one in place. At first glance, there are some striking differences though. Bulgaria's minimum wage is about €551 per month, the lowest in the EU, while Luxembourg's is €2,704 a month, the highest. 8 countries, including Croatia, Malta, Estonia, Czechia, Slovakia, Romania, Latvia, and Hungary, have minimum wages below €1,000, whereas Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and France set theirs above €1,500. Over the past decade, Romania, Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Poland have seen the fastest minimum wage growth, while France and Malta have seen the slowest. However, these gaps do narrow once we adjust for purchasing power, since the cost of living varies widely country to country. For example, a €500 wage in Bulgaria can offer a similar real value to around €1,000 in Denmark, showing that lower wage economies catch up when living costs are taken into account. Finally, the share of workers earning close to minimum wage also differs by country. In 2022, more than 10% of employees in Bulgaria, France, Slovenia, Romania, Greece, Poland, and Hungary earned within 5% of their national minimum wage, while in Portugal and Czechia, only a small fraction did. And in 5 EU countries, Denmark, Italy, Austria, Finland, and Sweden, there's no minimum wage in place at all. Instead, wages are set through national or sectoral collective bargaining agreements, where trade unions and employer organizations negotiate sector-specific minimum pay rates. These effectively serve as minimum wage systems, and basically mean that minimum wages differ by occupation. For example, bus drivers, plumbers, and cashiers all have their own negotiated rates. In countries without statutory minimum wages, collective bargaining coverage is generally very high, reaching around 80 to 90% of the workforce, although enforcement can vary. In Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, strong unions, employer organizations, and high social trust ensure widespread enforcement, resulting in some of Europe's highest real wages. This Nordic model relies on bargaining between employers and employees to regulate the labour market, with minimal state involvement. By contrast, in Italy, collective agreements are weaker in practice. Coverage varies widely between sectors, and many young, part-time, and informal workers are excluded from active contracts. In addition, numerous agreements have expired but remain informally applied, creating what analysts describe as a grey zone in wage protection. This situation has contributed to low pay for young workers, and a growing exodus of young Italians seeking better job opportunities abroad. Anyway, this intra-European divergence has sparked some debate within the EU, where at least some politicians have proposed introducing a mandatory EU-wide minimum wage to help reduce inequalities, prevent a destructive race to the bottom in labour costs, and mitigate brain drain in countries with the lowest wages, such as those in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe. However, introducing a common EU minimum wage would be extremely difficult. Article 153, Section 5 of the EU Treaty explicitly excludes pay determination from the EU's competence, meaning that the EU cannot legally impose a common wage model. It can coordinate, recommend, or support one, but not set binding wages. To introduce a minimum wage, the EU would need either treaty change, a major political process requiring unanimous agreement from all member states, which given the current divisions within the bloc would be unlikely to succeed, or a new legal interpretation expanding EU competence, which would be highly controversial and face likely legal challenges. Moreover, wage levels and costs of living vary widely across the bloc, making a single absolute EU minimum wage both unfair and economically unworkable. A more feasible approach would be a relative minimum wage, where each member state sets its minimum as a percentage of its own median or average wage, taking differences in productivity and living costs into account. So while a binding EU minimum wage doesn't seem likely in the near future, the EU has taken steps in that direction. In 2022, it adopted the EU directive on adequate minimum wages, which establishes a framework to ensure that statutory minimum wages are adequate, targeting roughly 60% of the national median wage. Countries without a statutory minimum wage are not legally required to introduce one, but that directive requires member states with less than 80% collective bargaining coverage to develop a plan to strengthen their wage-setting systems. Now, not everyone was happy with this directive. Denmark, supported by Sweden, attempted to block it, arguing that wage setting should remain the prerogative of member states, primarily through collective agreements between trade unions and employers, and that the EU had no authority to legislate on pay. Denmark's opposition was not just about the perceived overreach, it's also about protecting the Nordic model of collective bargaining, which already covers around 80% of workers, well above the EU average of about 60%. As we mentioned, most Danish workers benefit from strong union-negotiated wages, and there's some anxiety that if the EU starts setting common wage frameworks, employers might rely on the statutory minimum instead of negotiating with the unions, which could undermine unions' bargaining power and reduce the coverage of collective agreements over time. Although we should say here that a recent study by the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions found that an increase in statutory minimum wage typically leads to a slight increase in negotiated wage floors and can reinforce rather than weaken collective bargaining. In conclusion then, the EU's directive on adequate minimum wages marks an important step towards strengthening social and labour rights. Earlier this week, the EU's top court ruled against Denmark, finding that the directive does not constitute direct interference by EU law. And while it adjusted 2 provisions, the directive remains largely intact. While only 8 states have so far implemented the directive, the ruling was welcomed by the Socialists and Democrats group, who called it a powerful signal of hope and social justice amid the cost of living crisis. By now, you've probably heard all about this story online, but depending on where you read about it, you might have heard a completely different side of the story. So how are you supposed to know what's real and what's being fabricated by one side or the other? Well, this week we're lucky enough to be sponsored by Ground News, who are the experts in helping you rethink how you consume media online. Their website and app collects thousands of articles, putting them all in one easy-to-access place to help expose outlets' political bias, how relying their reporting practices are, and who owns them, with all of their information backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. And whenever we're faced with a nuanced story, we just head straight to Ground News to get the breakdown on everything we need to understand it better. For example, if we wanted to learn more about the EU's top court rejecting Denmark's bid to annul EU rules on minimum wage, we just need to go to Ground News to see that 74 sources are reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the left, and those left-wing outlets focusing on worker protection, while the right-wing outlets that are reported on it instead prioritize discussing the limiting of EU power. You can see quickly who owns the outlets behind each story, and that context matters. Once you start noticing how independent sources frame things differently than massive conglomerates, it changes how you read the news. We've even used it to filter out corporate-owned media when we want a wider mix of voices or hone in on the highest-rated factual outlets. It's one of the few tools that actually helps you shape your media diet, not the algorithm. You know it's no secret just how much we appreciate Ground News. Having such an incredible tool to help us stay fully informed and aware of political bias is a game changer in today's media landscape. And as such, we partner with them to offer TLDR viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description or go to ground.news/TLDR or even scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.